Katherine Seligman's novel At the Edge of the Haight won the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction, which was created 20 years ago by Barbara Kingsolver, an author many of you, I'm sure, know, who has called this book a, quote, lightning bolt for empathy, unquote, for the plight of homelessness. Katherine has lived in the Haight for decades and reported on social issues, homelessness, mental health, and urban life for both the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Examiner. Along with serving as a correspondent at USA Today, her work has appeared in Redbook, Life, Money, California Magazine, the anthology Fresh Takes, and elsewhere. Katherine, it's a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to feature your book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here, Linda.
And in conversation with Katherine is Michael Wilkos. As Senior Vice President for Community Impact at United Way of Central Ohio, Michael's expertise is in community revitalization. His team at United Way develops effective strategies to improve our community and invest in programs that carry out these strategies. Michael, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure, Linda, to be with you. It's always a joy to partner with Gramercy Books on Author Night as you bring some excellent authors to whet the appetites of avid readers in Central Ohio. So thank you.
And thank you to
We are
all.
here to talk about.
I just wanted to just get the program started. A warm welcome now to Katherine Seligman in conversation with Michael Wilkos. All yours.
Right, thank you. As I read the book, it made me think about the situation of homelessness in cities across the country. And the reality is that many of us don't have to look very far to see homeless in our city, but many of us pass by, maybe not wanting to make eye contact or think too deeply about what might have gone wrong or when did it go wrong for that person that we just passed. But Katherine Seligman's first novel gives us a glimpse of what life is like for the 20-year-old homeless woman in San Francisco. And right from the opening, I was captivated by a shocking scene. I found the story to be deeply layered and complex and told with sensitivity and compassion. I hope that when people read At the Edge of the Haight, it will allow themselves to more deeply understand the stress and fear of living unsheltered in the open. Without judgment or blame, Katherine takes the reader deeply into a world most of us cannot imagine. So thank you for your powerful work, Katherine, and I'm honored to speak with you this evening about your novel. And so let's get started. You know, San Francisco is a beautiful city, and many of us go there for vacation, and there's many things that city is proud of, but it's also well known for having a very large homeless community. Tell us about the changes you have seen in the city and your experience with homelessness there, but also just describe for us the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood.
Well, thank you. It's so, first of all, it's so nice to be here with you and you're very right. What is going on in San Francisco and has been going on for practically the entire time I have lived here is a very visible symptom of what's hitting this country in general, of unaffordability and inequality of income that's caused a huge crisis of homelessness. And you see it in San Francisco, and you really see it in Los Angeles as well. You know, I think partly because of our climate, that people who are living unhoused don't, you know, they might not be in shelters, that they can survive outdoors. So it's a much more visible scene here than it is other places. And it's just something that San Francisco has been trying to cope with for decades. And it's been proved to be very difficult. So the Haight specifically has traditionally been a place where kids come through. The dreamers, the seekers, the travelers. And that was especially true, of course, in the Summer of Love, when the Haight became famous for the kids who were on the street. And ever since then, people have sort of come through thinking that it's the same. It's the Haight. They can come here and they will be welcome and it'll be easy to live here. And what they find is a very different and changed city where it is hard to live on the streets here. And there are more kids coming with huge issues that need to be resolved far beyond what was happening in the 60s and 70s.
And so clearly the characters of the book have found themselves in a very vulnerable situation. And the events of the last year with the pandemic, we've seen millions of people who have become quickly in a vulnerable situation that never thought they would. Millions of people will probably face eviction this year due to the pandemic. And so we can understand how something like the pandemic could suddenly make somebody vulnerable. But Maddie Donaldo, who's the main character in the book, she starts her adult life homeless after aging out of the foster care system. What does this story tell us about the causes of youth homelessness? And do youth experience homelessness differently than other populations from your perspective?
Well, I think that the populations have something in common with what leads to them being homeless, but certainly, definitely, youth who are exposed to trauma and unstable housing when they're growing up and family issues that are way beyond their control are much more likely, I think, to end up on the streets here in my neighborhood. And the thing is that each person has such a complex constellation of issues behind their why the reasons why they're homeless. And that's, sort of what makes it such a difficult thing to address, because it's not a one size fits all solution for anyone, really. It's very complicated.
So you chose to write this as a novel, but there are elements of the story that are from real life events. Tell us about your motivation to write At the Edge of the Haight.
Well, as Linda said, I've lived here for about 30 years and really in the center of the Haight, and worked as a journalist and a writer here, and have written about some of the issues here. And also, just as a resident here, I've come to talk to so many people, have done quite a bit of volunteer work in the neighborhood. And it's just something that had been percolating. And the real inspiration for this book, the seed of it, came from a night about 10 years ago when my husband and I were driving home through Golden Gate Park. And a man literally threw himself in front of our car and pleaded with us to stop. He had a little bit of blood on his forehead, right, just a trickle. And we called the police, and he pointed towards the grass area, and we could see the body of what turned out to be a young man lying there. And my husband, who's been an emergency room doctor, rushed out to see if there's anything he could do. It was a small stab wound that went right into the heart. So the kid died. And the follow-up on that was very small. The police did look into it, but there were 2 witnesses and one was dead. I hadn't really seen what happened. And I just remember one of the police officers saying to me, in response to me asking after the hearing where they let this killer go, what really happened? And, this guy's just going to go back and live in the park. And he said to me, neither one of these 2 is up to any good. And I think that's what really got to me, because I thought, how does he know? How does any of us know what the stories are, why those 2 lives crossed, the lives of those 2 people? And that's really what stayed with me.
Yeah, that would stay with any of us for sure. And so you write this book through the lens of Maddie, again, a 20-year-old young woman who finds herself living on the streets. She also loves her dog named Root that she rescued from the streets, coincidentally. And one night she follows Root into the brush and stumbles upon this similar story that you experienced of a young man who is taking his last breath, who's died from a wound. And if that experience were not bad enough, she witnesses what she believes to be the man who did it. And she says in the book, it is something that will live with her the rest of her life. So, do you think this book is a whodunit murder mystery story that also includes a homeless character? Or is this a book about homelessness that reveals the vulnerabilities that that life presents?
Well, sort of a little bit of both, but a little bit of neither of those. I think it does. I didn't. I would say I didn't really set out to write about homelessness per se, although I ended up doing a tremendous amount of research, which brought me to this character. But there is an element of mystery to it, I think, about who did it, did he do it? But I also wanted to look at the life of someone who we might pass every day on the street, and without thinking, what's this person's story? And that's really what I was trying to do, to sort of shed light into the life of someone who is basically unseen, as are a lot of people on the street, and a lot of the people who live housed. For instance, we may feel like we know our own children better than we do, and they may feel like they know us better than we do. I mean, how well can you ever know anyone? So I sort of wanted to get at that issue of proximity and how little we know about the people who we come in contact with. So that sort of larger existential issue, but also the social issue of just passing people by who we have no idea what their lives are like.
So let's go a little deeper about how witnessing the murder really affects Maddie's state of mind. The suspect threatens that he knows where to find her. This sets her into constant anxiety about when this man may come looking for her and what he might be capable of doing. Why doesn't Maddie, why does she stay in town? Why doesn't she go back to LA where she had grown up, or go to another city? Why doesn't she run when she's so consumed by the fear of what might happen to her next?
Good, that's a good question. I think, like a lot of people that are traumatized, I think she is so deeply traumatized that she's not able to move. She's not able to really respond in a way that we might think is more typical. And she ends up staying. Her desire to guard her own secrets about what has led her to be homeless, her fear about that, and I think her humiliation too at if people knew what had really gone on in her life, that they would turn away from her. So she chooses to be hidden rather than have to cope with that.
And while the book really focuses on how the murder affects Maddie, we also learn how it affects other characters in the book. And I think you've selected a short reading from us that really pulls into perspective the pain of characters Dave and Marva, the parents of the young man who was slain in Golden Gate Park. We later learn his name is Shane. So why don't you give us a short reading from the book?
I will do that. And okay. She must have said she was Shane's mother, or the officer wouldn't have told her anything. I have some bad news, he said. Shane has been, and she lowered her voice so I could hardly hear her say it, the victim of a homicide. She said she'd started screaming at him. Why are you telling me this? She just didn't get it. Who would call and say something like that? She didn't remember her neighbor coming over, but she must have been there, Marva said, because she found herself wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the couch when Dave came home. He'd handled the details, calm and ordered, in the way he always did. It was what made him so good at the fire department, where everyone looked up to him. Stay focused, he always told them. Respond, assess, and then go forward. Don't rush in without the information. He was the one who'd arranged for them to go to San Francisco. The worst thing was I never knew where Shane slept, Marva said. You want to know that, where they put their head down at night. Then when I went to bed, I could have pictured that. It would have helped. I should have been there with him. I thought I'd go later, but I didn't. You always think you have time. She was the one who wanted to rearrange furniture and get new rugs every spring, cook new dishes from recipes she found in magazines. But ever since Shane had left, she kept his room as he'd left it. The pictures on the wall, mostly cartoons he'd sketched of tiny armies of men facing off, a stockpile of catapults and bows and arrows behind them. She wished she'd asked him more questions when he was there, because when she started examining the miniature cartoon faces after he left, she could tell each one was different. From a distance, they looked the same. Maybe he was telling a story and not just doodling. The last time he'd called, he almost sounded like he missed her, but maybe she'd imagined that. Where are you staying? She'd asked. He didn't answer. She'd offered to wire him money and was half glad when he refused, because David said that only enabled him. And she should let him go and find his own path, as if she had any choice. He'd gotten off the phone as quickly as he could, and he'd said, "Bye, Ma. Some guys and I were going for food." I thought he'd come back for Thanksgiving because we're always there together, no matter what, she said. Yet clearly that didn't happen. She looked at me pleading. Why didn't I trace his phone? We could have pinpointed where he was. There's technology for that. At least we'd know where he was. We should have moved, she said to Dave, who was hunched in the back seat. Root had made it over the seat and was sandwiched between them. There would have been more for him in a city. We could have lived out, all could have lived out here. Her voice got louder. Dave reached over Root and put an arm around her. She slid away and turned completely around in her seat. Ma, she said, just like when he was little. He called me Ma.
So not only do we have these two characters, Maddie, who comes across Shane with his last breath, but now we're watching this relationship evolve between Maddie and the parents of the slain young man. But what we know is that Maddie is a person that wants to be invisible, let alone try to find her, because they wouldn't, she would say. And yet many people did keep finding her, the police, the suspect who committed the murder, but most notably were frequently the parents, Dave and Marva. The parents were desperate to learn more about their son's life, but tell us more about the relationship Maddie then develops with Dave and Marva and how important that is for all of them.
Well, she is sort of fighting with herself about wanting a relationship with them and wanting to completely shut them out, because she feels that they would have no idea about how she lived. And why should she trust them? Every adult in her life who she trusted had left or betrayed her. So she's very suspicious of their wanting to help her. And they are equally desperate to know how their son lived, where he put his head down at night. And if they could know what had happened to him, they feel like they would be somehow at peace. And they feel that she has that secret. And partly, this is something that I actually truly believe. And it was also an inspiration for writing the novel, which is that she had been there when he died. And I somehow, I don't know why, sort of believe that if you're honored to be with someone when they draw their last breath, that you're somehow connected to that person. And I let that sort of filter into the book as well.
So, I want to talk about living in Golden Gate Park. Maddie had the ability to give you a tour of the park, maybe a non-traditional tour, where to set up, where to sleep, where not to get hassled. But you had to set an alarm to get up every day at 4 a.m. to move out so you wouldn't get hassled by the police. How does this life in the park really wear on Maddie's life and psyche?
It's so difficult to live there and to always be sort of on guard, always be worried about what's going to happen next. And that's something that really became apparent to me the more kids I talked to, was how difficult it is, what a full-time job it is to live outside. And so while they did have this wonderful little community, and I have seen the loyalty and love that some of the kids who band together have for each other, I just think it's such a difficult thing. Sometimes we see them and they're they might be sitting there with a sign or an instrument, and or saying, I'll tell you a joke, for $5 or something, to get our attention. But in fact, it's a lot of work to live like that.
And so, we get glimpses about Maddie's childhood at different times of the book. Early on, we know that the father was abusive and leaves when she's quite young. And Maddie's mother does quite well for a while. She keeps Maddie on a schedule, makes her do chores, manages on a budget. But things don't work out in the end for Maddie and her mother, because her mother suffers from severe depression, which leaves Maddie floating from several different homes before aging out of that childcare system. How do these experiences contribute to Maddie living in Golden Gate Park? Yet on the other hand, we have Shane, who had a very different journey, one that you depict as coming from a stable, loving, middle-class family, two journeys, same spot, homeless in Golden Gate Park. What do these two very different journeys tell us about the vulnerability of who can become homeless?
Well, that it can happen to kids who are, for whatever reason, vulnerable, whether it's trauma, and in Maddie's case, it may have been some kind of mental illness or learning disabilities in some way that Shane clearly was, he didn't fit in with his family and they had no way of knowing. So I think, and in kids that I have talked to and run across, I have found that they came from all different backgrounds. There were have been a lot of kids who did come from foster care, but there were kids whose parents they would send them packages or wire them money, and knew that they were out there and didn't understand at all what had happened. So it wasn't a question of, being a good kid that this doesn't happen to, because good kids get, they're all sort of good. Some kids get into trouble and without parents understanding why. And I think if you have kids, you see that. There were so many times in my kids growing up where I had no idea what they were thinking or what really happened. So I think that.
Would you give advice to parents about how to pursue that curiosity about what's going on in their young adult children's lives now that you've had this experience of living in San Francisco and writing this novel that could be inspiration to families across the country?
Well, I don't know about that, but one of the things that someone said to me, and it was probably at my kids' school, and they're both, as I might have said, they're in their 20s now. But I remember in high school, a counselor saying to a group of us parents that, let's talk about what your kids are going through socially, academically, and every aspect of their life, because kids, we're not talking about, as I said, good kids and troubled kids. Good kids dabble in drugs. Good kids might steal something from a grocery store. Good kids. So if you can, just keeping communication open, but it's not within our control, because as you could see, these parents they adored their son. They just had no idea what was going on with him. And I think, I do think that happens. So I think, often we judge parents too and say, oh, well, what did they do? Their kid ended up in Golden Gate Park. And often it's some situation or condition beyond their control.
We will move to questions from viewers in about 10 minutes. So please continue to put those in the Q&A and not the chat if you have a question that you would like Katherine to answer for you. So, it's really hard for many of us to really, truly imagine what life on the street must feel like. Maddie is always worried after it got dark that people would come and, pick over her. They could take her pack, her shoes, her coat, or worse. There's this constant fear. And there are many times that Maddie is making decisions with her street family. There's Ash and Hope and Fleet, who are really part of her strong social network, where they have conversations about whether or not they're going to go to the shelter or stay in the park. And they almost always prefer the park, unless there's really bad weather. What do you want the readers to know about these decisions that people make about whether or not they want to be out on the land or go to a shelter?
Well, I think sometimes that kids and adults too might avoid a shelter or a safe place to sleep or a program that's offered to them because they're suspicious and because there are a lot of rules and because of what's come before that they might not want to accept living in a place that has all these rules, and they do kick you out at early in the morning, and it's just perceived that you're under somebody's control. So there are a lot of people who would prefer to take their chances in the park. And I've met some of those people. There's has been during the pandemic, there haven't been as many people sleeping in the park because they're not allowing camping. You'll see people in tent encampments on the street, which are allowed. But I just think that there's sometimes a reluctance to accept help.
So because of the pandemic, are you seeing more homeless? They're just now in a different location.
Well, I think both. I think that the shelters emptied out practically. And so all of the people who had been relying on shelters were suddenly on the street. A lot of them in tent encampments. And there's been a lot of tension and argument in the city about should we allow people to be sleeping in tents on the street at all. And also a lot of people who lost jobs and housing or were staying with family or friends. They were couch surfing, and people just said, there's a pandemic, you got to get out. So a lot of those reasons, I think, put more people on the street. Actually, I'm not sure we know exactly how many people are on the street because there's been a difficulty this year in counting them. There have been between 7,000 and 8,000 people in San Francisco, a city of about 800,000. But I don't know right now how many there are because of the difficulty counting.
So, the other thing that I was reflecting on with the book is that Maddie constantly is reflecting how she doesn't want to get involved, right? She didn't really see anything. I mean, she saw Shane take his last breath, but she goes to extraordinary lengths to research and find the ex-wife of the suspect that she believes killed this young man. And she wants to learn more about this man that has threatened her. And this knowledge adds to just more fear since the ex-wife is terrified of her former husband. And these are extraordinary steps that she takes for a person who is reluctant to get involved. And not long after, Dave and Malva, the parents of the boy that was killed, tracked down her family members. And she is not happy about that investigative approach they took, even though she did the same for herself. So she really has lots of connections, both with her family and now with the parents of the young man she saw get killed. What does the book tell us about the social needs and networks of people who live outside and how they need to create those networks in order to have either a sense of community or to stay safe.
Yeah, I think very much that people form alliances and little bands of trust in order to get along once they're outside on the street or in the park. I've seen it, that happen a lot. And I do think there's often a lot of trust and love between the kids who band together. It also can cause a lot of problems. And I think Maddie bonds with these kids as a way to sort of create an alternative family. And she is drawn, though, to know the truth of what happened, as is she drawn to know what happened to her own family later on. And so I think there's a parallel between her feeling obligated in some way to help this family get the information they need, but also to move closer to that reality in her own life. And they try to help her. It doesn't really work, but they try to do the same thing to her. So they're both, unbeknownst to the other one, secretly trying to find out what happened.
There was one review that I read of the book that said, these downtrodden characters act just like many other families. They bicker, drift together and apart, and find room for love and compassion. So just give us an example or two about this adopted family Maddie has created on the street, and maybe an example of where it's caused her frustration, and at other times it's really given her real support and love.
Well, she bonds with them and they support her through, there's a couple episodes where her dog is gone and they try to help her get the dog back and to support her as well as they can through this, what is to her just this horrible loss of the dog that's her main companion in life. So I think there's this real sense of them as a family, yet she's practically derailed by her affection for Ash, who she sort of has a relationship with, and he is not going in the same direction that she is going in. And I think that is it's a threat to her being safe. Is he wants her for himself. He can't understand how she might want to have a life on her own or to rediscover her own family. So their love for each other, I think, is palpable, but also there's a lot of conflict in their relationship.
And so help the viewers this evening who might have had the opportunity to read the book yet. Tell us about the timeline of the events that this novel covers. When I personally got to the last page, I wanted to turn to find just one more chapter. I wanted to see what was going to happen next with Maddie. Why did you choose, and I'm not going to tell people, how the story ends, but, without giving away the details, why did you choose to end the story where you did?
Well, I thought a lot about where she would go, who she was and what she would do. And I've also talked to a number of young people in great detail about their own lives and what they were hoping for. And it just felt like I couldn't wrap it up neatly. There was going to be no easy redemption with great music playing in the background and, and ending where everything works out. It's not total devastation, but I just really felt like that was sort of what would happen. I couldn't resolve it easily, because in real life it's such a complex situation, and it wouldn't be one where it was just resolved and then she went on to have a great life and she married her boyfriend, and there was going to be a lot to come. So I did think a lot about that.
Well, I wanted one more chapter just so I could find out whether or not it was going to end like a Hollywood movie and have a happy ending, or was I going to have a foreign film and have unresolved business, right? And it wasn't going to work out in the end. So thank you for not answering all of those curiosities that I had when I got to that last page. We have several questions that I'd like to transition to. Before we do that, though, as readers get to that last page and they close the book, what would you like for them to walk away with and think and reflect on as they finish the book?
Well, I hope that I hope that people will have been taken somewhere inside a character's mind, and that is so unlike their own, not life that is so unlike their own. But in general, I just think we all need to keep our eyes open. That doesn't mean we have to get hugely involved. It doesn't mean we have to spend the rest of our lives, volunteering somewhere, but just to be someone who notices what's going on and looks beyond the surface, that someone is more than what you see at the time, that everyone came from somewhere. I mean, some of these kids that come through don't have a place to go home to. They don't have anyone who's looking for them. But everyone has a story that put them there. And and that's sort of one of the things that, really intrigued me. And I hope that people will be left with that notion of, they're walking down the street, they see someone, and they really start to wonder about the humanity of that person.
So our first question is from Beth Irvin, and she asks that she's particularly interested in the links between homelessness and mental illness. Effective resources to deal with mental illness seem to be in short supply for everyone and can be difficult to access. With the effects of the pandemic on mental health, what do you anticipate in terms of increased need and also the capacity to deal with it?
That is a great question. And in some ways, I'm not qualified to answer it because I'm not, you're probably more qualified to answer it. I don't, I don't have a background in public health, but I do think, from talking to people and seeing what's going on, particularly with people who are living outside or in some of the tent encampments that have sprung up here and in my neighborhood, that yes, there's definitely greater need for mental health treatment and counseling, and it's really affected people in a huge way. I mean, just the sort of fear and uncertainty. That said, there are some kids that I've talked to who've said, they're not so worried about the pandemic. It's more day-to-day life for them, and they're not as focused on it as we might be, that they're still focused on just trying to survive day to day. But I do think it's really true that the need for mental health services and counseling and all different kinds of services is vastly grown because of the pandemic, and something that needs to be addressed.
Another question from Lisa Cordes. She says, I never want to just walk by a person who is homeless, but I don't know what to do or say. What is your advice?
Another great question, because I do think that it's important not to seem like we're intruding. We're asking questions of people that they might not want to answer. But I think acknowledging people and talking to them, particularly if they're people you see all the time, is something that we should absolutely do. You might get the feeling that somebody doesn't want to talk about where they come from or why they're there, but that they may talk about just how long they've been in the neighborhood and how are they that day, and are they hungry, and just even pleasantries. I sometimes just, one day I was walking down the street and some kids asked me if I would pitch pennies with them. And I just thought, I just said yes, but as long as I'm not keeping the pennies, I'm not keeping anything.
What is pitching pennies?
Pitching pennies is where you throw a coin sort of against the wall and you see whether it lands, I guess heads or tails. I think that's what it is, if my memory is right. And then based on your guess, you keep the coins, and they were using quarters. But my first thought was, I'm going to the grocery store and, like, are they trying to scam me or what, like, what is going on? But then I just thought, hey, I've never pitched pennies. So sure, teach me how to do it. I just spent like 20 minutes and had a great conversation with them, these kids who I saw for the next week or so. And every time they would see me, one of the guys would go, hey, mom,
Oh,
So anyway, but I just think that engaging with people that you see the same way you'd engage with anyone, if it's possible. I mean, there are clearly a lot of people who are in such distress that you wouldn't do that. I mean, who are delusional or just really seem in too much distress or pain to try to engage with.
thank you. Our next question has a few questions built into it. It's from Suzanne Merrily. Do you want to share a message on the ways adults question children and on the ways the comfortable or affluent reach out to the poor people, particularly homeless people? Maddie censors herself and makes critiques of Ash and even more of Shane's parents. What do you want readers to learn from Maddie and the interaction between the principal characters?
Well, I think that that to try to see people as they are instead of as they should be, which is very hard as a parent to do. And I think that once again, you need to keep your eyes open and the lines of communication open. But that doesn't mean that, parents, I don't think that parents shouldn't have, rules or expectations. It just means that we have an understanding that our kids sort of have, have their own lives. And if we want to be part of it, we have to keep the conversation going. I mean, they really don't until they're in their 20s and maybe never have a realization of what's in our minds. That's part of what drew this, me into this novel too, was just the sense of how little kids see their parents as people, see them as parents and not as people who've had independent lives. So there's just sort of a limit in what you can know about another person. But I think that you really have to try to communicate with a kid where that kid is.
Another viewer said that they spent 10 days in San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle 2 years ago. The consistent, prominent homeless population was breaking their hearts. Now, they heard you say that you identified climate as a factor of why, San Francisco might be a better place to be unsheltered and homeless. But are there other features of those cities that are contributing to significant homelessness on West Coast markets?
Well, I think that the affordability issue is a huge thing, and that a lot of people they get here and they can't afford to get a place. And I've talked to kids who said they came here I remember talking to a young woman from Florida, and she just thought she'd come here and she'd get a job with, doing music or something. She had some vague idea of something, and she just said, there's no way she'd ever be able to afford anything. She could never afford to move into an apartment here. So she was stuck. She couldn't get home and she couldn't afford an apartment. So I think it's just, these are very expensive places to live. They're traditionally tolerant places, so to speak, although I think, I know in San Francisco, my particular neighborhood is, debating how tolerant should we be and sort of at war with itself over that issue. So we have this legacy of being tolerant on the West Coast, but then there's, this sense of, well, what do we do? So, but that's it. I think the cities, some of the cities on the West Coast have come up with good, some good plans to help people too, but it has not resolved what's going on.
A question from Christine says, aside from mental illness, please address the impact of the opioid epidemic. It seems that there might be a romanticized notion of San Francisco or even California as a place for easy and availability of drugs.
Well, I don't know if it's more available here, but well, two things. One is that the neighborhood that I wrote about does have an opioid problem, but not of the degree that the downtown and other neighborhoods have, because it's a younger, more transient population. They're less, there's less of that crisis going on in this neighborhood, although it is going on. But absolutely, there's a huge crisis going on, and I think there've been 600 deaths, drug deaths in San Francisco this year, and you see it. It's very visible. You see it if you go into an area that is right next to our downtown called the Tenderloin, which some of you might be familiar with, and there's a drug crisis. There's a lot fueling that. But that is definitely going on here. It's going on in cities across the country. It's going on very visibly here. And I think the city is desperately trying to figure out what it can do to help it, other than just arrest a lot of people.
We are also one of those cities struggling with the opioid epidemic. We have a question from Martin, and he asks, with the causes of homelessness being so complex, I imagine the remedies are as well. It is a whole community challenge. Are there places or communities that you are aware of that are on the right track? What is working to solve the challenges that you see in San Francisco?
Well, I think there are some other cities that have done great work. One of them being Salt Lake City. It's become known for its approach to housing people and offering programs. I think there are some examples of programs around the city and on the West Coast, and I'm sure on the East Coast too, that I don't know of, that offer a place for long-term housing for people, where it's not a place you check into and then you have to leave. You don't have, a year or 6 months to get your life in order. It's more, here are the keys to your place, and you do something, and you can stay there. You got to be engaged in something, but this is a long-term solution for you. I think that's what is needed, are services like counseling and, of course, drug programs, but things that are going to be long-term solutions to give people stability in where they live, and a sense that they're going to be part of the vibrant part of the community. They'll get that there are things that they can do and live here and be part of the city.
So we've got just a few more questions, and we will close the program with Linda. The next one is from Sonia Thessing, who leads Huckleberry House, which is an organization that serves vulnerable youth. And she asks, from your experience and relationships in the park, can you talk about youth wanting to be invisible or refusing help compared to adults? And also, just so you know, she can't wait to read the book because she's going to have it as a staff book read.
Oh,
a lot more readers there.
Yeah. Well, I think that as I said, I'm not sort of a public health person, so that's a hard question for me to answer. But I do think that the youth coming through have have a different set of challenges. I mean, sometimes they overlap, but they are suspicious and sometimes don't want to accept help, as I'm sure this person who asked the question knows. And several of the groups, the wonderful groups here in San Francisco, offer counseling. People go out on the street and form relationships with kids who are living there. And I think that's been one of the more successful parts of program here. And I have a character in the book who does that, who's formerly homeless. And I had talked to people who'd lived in the park or who'd lived on the street and then worked for agencies that were trying to do something about it. But their sort of expertise came from both studying what was best, but this sort of personal knowledge and feeling for what it is to go out on the street and talk to kids and try to help them and to figure out person by person what is needed.
So the next question comes from Carly Booz, who leads an affordable housing advocacy organization. And she says, I wonder if you see, quote, freedom, end quote, as a character in this book, and whether they would be an antagonist or a protagonist.
Ooh, that's quite a question. Well, I think, maybe a little bit of both, because people do, it would be seeking some kind of agency over your own life that these kids don't feel that they have. But I think, it's also, you get to a certain level of maturity and you realize that you don't have that much power. It doesn't all depend on individual will and freedom. And so you do have to work within a society and a social situation. So
I'll do one last question and then we'll turn the program back over to you, Linda. This is from Pat Schmidt. What drew you to the Haight and why do you still live there?
I moved to the Haight originally before I was married, and I just saw it as being one of the most vital neighborhoods in the city. I really wanted to be in a place where I could walk everywhere. And I found I knew the people, the merchants who, on my street. And there was just a kind of neighborhood feeling that really drew me in. And then we ended up living in a flat here and having kids and thinking, I thought when we had kids, we'd move to someplace quieter, but it was great to be in a community and a place where you feel like you can know your neighbors. And San Francisco does have a sort of these little neighborhoods, and people get very passionate about their neighborhoods. And they say, we're only 7 square miles, but they'd say somebody from, who lives in another neighborhood would say, oh, I'd never live in that neighborhood. I never go there. But I was just really captivated by this neighborhood and by the huge variety of people who live here. It certainly has become less affordable, and there are more people who are, might work for tech companies and fewer musicians and artists and, other teachers. But I'm still just feel a part of this neighborhood, as crazy as it is.
Well, Katherine, there was actually one last question that was in the Q&A, and I don't want to leave that out. I think we have time for it. It's another one from Beth Irvin. What do you think about the pros and cons of giving money to people on the street? She remembers a well-meaning campaign that said something like, put your change where you can make a change, that discouraged direct giving and encouraged giving to organizations dedicated to helping. Do you have a philosophy on that?
Well, there was this campaign pushed by a former mayor, Care Not Cash, and which did tell people, try to support services and not let people who ask you for money just get away with getting all this change, because they'll just, it's not going to help them. But I think it's, for me, it's an individual thing. I often buy food for people because if someone is hungry and I'm walking to the store, I see nothing wrong with getting them a sandwich or buying dog food for someone who's out on the street and he doesn't have enough money to do that. I think it's a really individual thing. I have a dear friend who gives money to absolutely everyone because that's just how she feels. And I also know people who feel like it's not the right thing to do. So I think people really vary, even within the tolerant Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. And I said, I personally do. I went through a time when I only gave money to women because I thought, well, I have to put a lid on this. Like I can't be giving money to everyone I pass. And so I thought, well, I'll just give money to women. But that's changed, and it's really a case by case basis. Sometimes also there's something so simple you can do for someone, like giving them a solar charger for their phone. Or I have been known to force my husband to come down on the street and provide some medical care. So, there are things that you can, that one can do depending on what one wants to do. So I don't think there are any really rules about do it or don't do it.
Well, Katherine, thank you so much for writing this novel. Thank you for spending your evening with us, and for all the folks who joined in and your really great questions. We'll let Linda Cass close us out for the evening.
I want to thank you too before that happens. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And, this is somebody who's really in the midst of it and working with organizations that are trying to help people. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, as I know our audience has. It's been a very active chat area, which I hope you guys didn't watch, or it would have been quite distracting to your conversation. But again, we've got such treasures in our community here in Columbus, Katherine. We have United Way of Central Ohio, and we have Community Shelter Board, and we have Lutheran Social Services, and Huckleberry House, who is here actually participating in the chat and the questions. And we're so grateful for the ability to have this conversation, and the fact that a book like yours has really triggered this kind of program for us. So thank you for your illuminating insight, Katherine and Michael, for your probing and comprehensive questions. It has been very much an illuminating evening